Specific- Specifically, we're going to talk about stereotype threat, but also related concepts to that. And we'll look at a little bit of the institutional data that Jonathan's going to share in just a few minutes from CSU Pueblo as well, but we'll give you a little bit of time to reflect on some of your own possible stereotypes and some of the things that you all may be grappling with specifically at CSU Pueblo. And as always, hopefully we are brainstorming and thinking about successes and future ideas and things that we want to do to foster equity-based teaching. So we'll be talking about challenges, but also this is a space for you to share the things that are going well and the things that you are doing, because I'm sure a lot of you are doing some great things already on campus. So the agenda, what are we doing in this hour and a half? We're welcoming ourselves right now, and I do have a bit of a presentation that's should just take the first 20 to 30 minutes, so it will not be like this for the majority of what we're doing. But we did want to present some general concepts and some studies and some ideas, and then we had about 30 minutes reserved for breakout groups. So you'll have a good bit of time to talk in some smaller groups with the fellows and with each other about these issues. And then we'll have some time at the end to get back together, hopefully at least 20 minutes or so, for some debrief and whole group discussion. So like you, I teach classes where the classes I teach are very discussion heavy. And so I do tend to spend a lot of time. I love doing this particular activity where I have the students co-construct our norms for the classroom and how we're going to discuss and engage with each other. And especially as things have moved online and they go kind of back and forth between online and hybrid, I think it's really nice to take some time to do that. And the activity that I love to do honestly takes about 30-45 minutes. So we're not going to have time to do that in this first hour and a half session. But I thought I thought I could at least offer some suggestions for engagement. And again, these are obviously suggestions. I know that as we talk about these issues, hopefully we are challenging ourselves and we are challenging each other, but in a very constructive way, and in a way that helps us all grow, but in a way that we approach this with a sense of curiosity and learning. So these are the engagement suggestions I might offer, at least for our first session, since we don't really have the time to co-construct this together. But just the idea that if we can approach this with a sense of curiosity, we're all learning. I mean, I will offer myself up as someone who's continually learning in this area, in this field. I'm constantly exploring my own identity, my own role, my positionality in the classroom, what that means. I have a really nice situation at the University of Denver where I teach in 3 different programs. And so I teach some very, if you will, traditional graduate students in one program. I teach very what we call non-traditional, or as nowadays we're saying, the new traditional students in a different kind of graduate program. And then I also teach in an alternative bachelor's completion program. So I have very different populations in those 3 classes. And even though I teach the same content, it's a space where I'm always continually learning and seeing how my own white identity shows up so very differently in these different contexts. And so I guess I would just offer that I'm learning. I don't at all claim to be the expert in the areas that we're talking about today, but what I can at least offer is to bring together some ideas and some strategies and some concepts and have us create a space where we can talk about them. So I don't anticipate, any issues that we would have, but just to offer again that we share this responsibility for the space and the discussion, and this is really a space for you all to learn and grow. We'll have some independent reflection time in the middle, and then a lot of time for you to constructively discuss with each other. And Denise, this one's a little bit more for you as well, just being able to connect the in-person and the virtual participants. I know sometimes that can be challenging in these situations, so we'll do our best to make this, a really hopefully productive, useful discussion for all of us. And why this work. So before I kind of get into sharing some of the thoughts and concepts, we did want to also share a little bit about your context at CSU Pueblo. And so I know Lynn kicked us off with a little bit of, where this Faculty Academy is coming from. And I'm going to turn it over now to Jonathan to share some information that's been collected at CSU Pueblo before we start with our other concepts. So Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And to kick off today's session, as Bridget mentioned, that there is some data that we got from the university using that very large data set, and very many thanks to Corey Schilling for providing us that data. And it mainly has to do with demographic differences in our university regarding GPA, pass rates, and DFW. But before I go on, you might hear some random construction noises in the background. I apologize for that. My neighbor suddenly decided to start up a project because, COVID pandemic, everyone needs a hobby. So I'd like to move on, please, to our first chart. Go ahead, next slide. Thank you. In this one, Corey's data was separated by quote unquote murky students, but I would think we would say that for another time. But there's also by gender, male and female, by described race, white or URM, and non-rural and rural students. Now, what we can see here is that female students in CSU Pueblo are going to have significantly higher GPA than men do. And on that regard, white students are also going to have significantly higher GPA than underrepresented minorities. We should also note, though, that these are going to be for classes that are at the 0, 1, and 200 level, because the data set did not include 3, 4, and graduate level courses. So please remember, these are going to be the highest serving classes, and this is the kind of GPA that we're seeing across the demographics. There isn't actually a significant difference, though, between non-rural and rural students' GPA. But as we look at their pass rates, may I have the next slide? We are still seeing a lot of significant differences across the genders. Women have higher pass rates than men do. Across race, white students will have a higher passing rate, and then non-rural students are also going to have a higher pass rate. And just by looking at non-rural and rural students, this almost appears to be independent of GPA, which, if you remember from the earlier slide, non-rural and rural students have about the same GPA. Oh, Dr. Yes brought up the operational definition of rural. I'm afraid I cannot provide that at the moment because I only got the numbers. Corey Schilling might be able to explain that quite a bit more than I can. They only gave me the data set.
Just curious. I'm just curious if Pueblo is considered rural, in other words.
No.
Compared to Denver, right? Okay.
No, but it's not classified.
No, yeah, not,
Okay.
Right, that's something I would probably
Thank you.
ask Corey in his office. I don't really have a lot of data for that one. Now, there is one curiosity that I found in the data, though, and it has to do with DFW rates, which is D, F, and withdrawal. So if I may have that slide. Now, granted, we would expect that if a certain demographic would have a lower pass rate, they would also have a higher DFW rate. I can't explain what's going on with the non-rural crowd because they apparently have a higher pass and DFW rate than rural students, and that's not something I can entirely explain. Now, what putting the entire data set together will show us, just based strictly on data alone for 0, 1, and 200 level classes in the university, is that the most successful student is going to be a white female from a non-rural area. That's what this data is telling us. However, well, right, there's, a lot of the data really will be self-reported, but there are also some things that could muddy up the data. Like, for example, what about students who do not subscribe to the male-female binary? And yes, the errors are incredibly large, but they do fit within significance, so that's just something to consider. This data is pretty much always going to be hazy. And the other issue is this, speaking of stereotyping, I just said that the most successful student based on this data in CSU Pueblo is going to be a white female who lives in the area. So that may already be, in a way, informing our stereotypes regarding what a successful student is like. So this is almost a little bit meta considering what we're talking about today. Do I have absolute magnitudes? I did not, because this was mainly just a simple t-test. I did not run that kind of an analysis with R. Yeah, this is all mostly done by t-testing. So, right, but knowing a lot of this data, even though we've got something that is backed up by some numbers, how is this going to inform where we move forward regarding addressing our personal stereotypes and our narratives regarding these different demographics at our campus? And for that, I give the floor back to Bridget. Thanks for letting me have the floor.
Thank you. Yes, and we did sort of talk offline about that a little bit, this idea of presenting these data and in a way giving you all a stereotype, and then we're talking about the impact of stereotype threat as we go through this today. But at the same time, I feel like this is a bit of a yes and instead of a yes but, where we have certain areas where we want to provide additional resources and support perhaps, and at the same time also be working on ourselves. And so I'm going to go through a number of slides here, sharing some different ideas and concepts, but I also just want to keep it open if people want to interrupt me at any time to share some thoughts, ideas, questions. Feel free to use the chat. I'll try to do my best to keep an eye on that, but again, feel free to just jump in at any point as well. But what I thought we would do is kind of start broad before we get to this specific concept of stereotype threat. And again, I'm very conscious of the fact that probably most of you that are here, or I say, we're preaching a little bit. I'm guessing most of you coming ready are passionate about this, are interested in this, and are probably very interested in how we can add inclusivity issues in our classes, how we can reduce equity gaps. But as they always say, the choir is always practicing, and they're the ones who kind of lead us through our daily and weekly routines. So even if this is the choir, I'll be asking you a few questions to see how familiar people are with different concepts. But I'll start with kind of the broad idea of inclusive excellence, which has been around for a long time, enough so that it's even a concept that is now somewhat criticized because it can be very abstract, and it's pretty easy for people to say, oh, I'm practicing inclusive excellence. And that's why today a lot of folks are talking about this broader issue now more in terms of like diversity, equity, and inclusion, because those are a little bit more quantifiable things that we can grasp. But there are different frameworks for inclusive excellence, and this is one that that I have tended to appreciate because it gives kind of a broad picture of all the things that we need to be doing if we want to be engaged in inclusive excellence. And I guess what even is inclusive excellence? It's really a way of raising up everybody by focusing on the benefits of diversity. So it's this idea that our overall success as a community is inherent and dependent on how well we value and engage and include everyone within that community. So for higher education, that's faculty, staff, administrators, alumni, everyone, students, of course, everybody that works on campus, and how much we embrace that diversity will actually benefit everyone. And that's the idea of excellence. But as you'll see here, there's many components. We're going to be talking more specifically about the inclusive pedagogy aspect, but it really starts with this intrapersonal awareness where we are doing, as they say, the self-work to explore our own biases, our own stereotypes, our own power and privilege, our own identities, and where they fit in with this broader context. So we certainly don't have the time to get into all of this in this first session today, but I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that there's a lot of self-work that has to happen. There's also the interpersonal awareness of knowing our community, knowing our students, as well as working on the overall broad environment, curricular transformation, all sorts of things. But what we'll focus on for at least the initial sessions are more of this idea of inclusive pedagogy. So what is that? And I'm sorry if this is tiny for some of you. I'll read a few of the key components of a few of these definitions, but the idea around inclusive pedagogy, and this is probably not surprising to anyone, is that it's teaching and learning in higher education in a way in which pedagogy, curricula, and assessment are designed to engage students in learning, that is meaningful, relevant, and accessible to all. It embraces a view of the individual and individual difference as the source of diversity that can enrich the lives and learning of others. So it's, as they say, more of an asset-based approach to looking at diversity. How can we use this in a way that brings everything up and brings all of us up? Inclusive pedagogy at its core is learner-centered and equity-focused, creates an overarching learning environment in which students feel equally invited and included. And the good news is there's a large body of research out there that is continually growing every day, much of it in this foundational scholarship of teaching and learning. And from that, what we are seeing is that learning outcomes are improved for everyone when teachers attend to student differences, take deliberate steps to ensure that all students across difference in academic and social backgrounds, as well as physical and cognitive abilities, feel welcomed, valued, challenged, and supported in their academic work. And so what's always interesting to me is this idea that we're not talking so much about content here and academic skills. We're talking about a sense of belonging. We're talking about feeling welcome, valued, challenged, supported. So that's a lot of what we're talking about today, are these pieces that kind of go around what we often think of as the more academic component. And I threw this out here just to give you a sense. I'm not going to talk about any of these in particular, but there are so many frameworks out there that are continually being built upon. A lot of them have somewhat subtle differences that are very important in very specific ways. But just to acknowledge that if you are very familiar with this area, you might have one or more, or even things that are not on this list that you're pretty familiar with that can help inform our discussions. But just to acknowledge there's a lot of work out there being done in this area. And then I also want to talk about this idea of equity versus equality. I think Denise and I were talking about this in one of our meetings before. And again, this might be somewhat of the preaching to the choir with this group as well, but I was doing some work earlier, actually in the spring, with more of a nursing kind of healthcare group. And it was really striking to me how that group in particular really resisted the idea of equity. They were very focused, and this was a group very dedicated to the success of their students, but they felt very strongly that their discipline had given them the message that they need to treat everybody exactly the same, and equality was the end all be all. And anytime anyone was given any different kind of treatment, that was going against what we were supposed to do as academics. And that's not always what I've heard. And I'll just go ahead and throw out my own bias here, which is that I don't think we ever treat everyone completely equally. So it's not something that probably already exists, but the idea of equity is that instead of treating everyone the same, we're treating people based on what they need to achieve the goals. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen images such as this. I'd love to even see like a show of hands, or even on Zoom, if you just give me a little hand or thumbs up. There's so many versions of this out there. If you just Google equity and equality and the cartoon, you'll see a lot of different versions of this. So most of you seem very familiar. I won't spend a lot of time on it. And there's lots of different versions that kind of take this to different levels. But the general sense of it is that if we're giving everybody that square box, that's assuming that we're all starting at the exact same place when we enter the classroom door. So if we have a learning goal and we have all the students coming in, if they all were exactly the same, then certainly giving them each that box would make sense. But in this visual case, we see that that's not going to give us the outcomes that we want, which is that everybody can see over the fence. So in our classrooms as well, we have always seen and acknowledged that some students have more interest, have more motivation for our content, have more background, have different things that really just set them up for different levels of being able to meet those outcomes with different types of support. So a lot of what we're talking about these days is this idea of equity. How do we provide opportunities for everybody, and perhaps equal opportunity to do different things, but yet the goal is really the outcome as opposed to what we're providing to students. And so I wanted to share one more thing before we get specifically into the concept of stereotype threat. And this is this idea of non-cognitive factors. And again, maybe just a little show of hands or thumbs up if anybody's fairly familiar with this. This is a little bit more in the world of psychology, and the term non-cognitive factors is a little, perhaps not the most motivational term out there, but essentially what they're referring to are all those things that are not just the content, if you will, or the critical thinking, the specific skills, knowledge, abilities that we're developing in the classroom. It's kind of all the things that exist around that actually predict academic behavior. And I've just been a big fan of University of Chicago. This consortium has they've been doing studies on this, very big studies for a long time, and they have a lot of really accessible research. So it's a great website if you want to check out what they do. But these non-cognitive factors are things like, beyond the academic behaviors that we can observe, there are things like perseverance, like our mindsets, learning strategies that we may use, or social skills. So a lot of the different things that go into being successful in college, but that are often beyond what we think we are teaching in our classrooms. And I realize that this next image there's a lot going on here. So let me just break it down a little bit and give you the general gist of it. And again, you're welcome to go explore any of this more as you'd like. But if you look at that very bottom box, that green box that says academic performance, that's often what we look at in education when we're trying to understand, are students being successful or not. We're looking at how well they perform, DFW rates, pass rates, GPA, all the stuff that we looked at before. But what feeds into that? Certainly there's the academic behaviors, that kind of orange box in there, which is really the things that are observable. Do they come to class? Do they turn in their work on time? Do they study for the test? Do they do the things that we can observe that make them a good student? But as we can see from this chart, there are so many other things that influence that yellow box. There's the social skills that they may or may not have. There's the academic perseverance, the grit, the resiliency that may be challenged in different ways. There's the learning strategies, just simply knowing the different kinds of strategies that make them successful in college. All of those things, students aren't often taught or necessarily supported with. And they're all kind of underlined by this idea of academic mindset, of do we think we can do well in this, or do we just think, have our parents told us, has society told us, have we told ourselves that we're just not good at math, or that we just aren't going to do well in school? And that kind of underlies all of these other things. So you can see the value and the importance of a lot that goes in behind just the academic behaviors. So just a few takeaways from what this group has been looking at. This idea that non-cognitive factors are strongly linked to academic performance, which then goes on to predict positive life outcomes, but they're not fixed traits. So it's not that students either have this or don't have this. We are seeing that we can impact this. They're shaped by our environments. They're shaped by what students hear, see, and feel from us, from teachers, schools, parents, society every day. So the bad news is a lot of students have been given a very negative academic mindset. The good news perhaps is that this is changeable, that we can impact this. So one of their big outcomes, this Chicago group, is students with poor academic behaviors or a lack of perseverance may be misperceived as students who are not motivated or students who do not care, when in fact they lack strategies or mindsets that would help them learn. So that's where it's often difficult for us to say, is the students just being lazy, or do they not kind of have some of these skills in place that will help them get through some of the challenges of college? And so this is one study that I pulled out that I shared with some folks earlier, and not at all to kind of put this on STEM faculty. I think there's a lot of studies about mindsets, especially with STEM folks, because a lot of it's around testing. And to be honest, like STEM, there's a lot of tests, and in a lot of other humanities classes, we just don't have that same kind of data to pull from. And also we have some bigger numbers in a lot of these studies. But this is a study that really hit me hard when I was reading this idea that in this study, which is it's 150 STEM professors and more than 15,000 students that they looked at. And they looked at mindsets, they looked at how students approached these courses, their motivation for it. And what they found from this is that the students who were in classes where their faculty had more of a fixed mindset had twice the racial achievement gaps, just by looking at the, again, the kind of fixed mindset-ness, if you will, of the faculty members. And I'm trying to pull out this one quote that that I thought was very interesting, this idea that consistent with the theory that faculty's fixed mindset beliefs are demotivating to students. So when we give students this sense that we don't think they're going to do well, they can pick up on it and it can be demotivating. So in those classes, students reported less motivation to do their best work in the classes where faculty endorsed more fixed mindsets. And students reported that in those classes, the professors were less likely to use pedagogical practices that emphasize learning and development. So it's kind of a cyclical thing. They weren't using these learning focused methods. The students would pick up on that, felt they weren't expected to do well. And then in the end, the achievement gaps were pretty low. And of course, as we see in these studies time and time again, the effect was larger for underrepresented minority students. So I won't go into this. It's something you can look into, and I'm sure there are all sorts of complications with studies, but it was just a really powerful one for me to look at, to see the impact that we can have. And I am privileged to work with a woman named Sandra McGuire, who I get to teach some of her courses around teaching students how to learn. And she has just recently come out with this new concept, if you will, that she's titling Metacognitive Equity. And it's really the same idea that students arrive at college with very uneven levels of these things, of cognitive skills, study skills, role models, knowledge of the hidden curriculum, if you will. And so a lot of what we can do in college is help teach them these things. I also, just as a little aside, I get to teach a course about designing a motivational syllabus. And the last time that we taught it, someone was telling me this idea about office hours. The idea is about the hidden curriculum, if you've heard that term, that there's so much that we kind of assume students know when they arrive at college, and especially for first generation students, some of what we expect, that all the acronyms that we use and the different offices and just navigating the college experience is difficult enough. But in this particular instance, I heard of a student who saw a syllabus that said office hours, 4 to 6 p.m. or whatever the times were. And we tend to think the students would know what we're talking about with office hours, but this particular student thought that office hours meant that was when the professor, the instructor, was working and not to be disturbed. And so when the student was asked, why don't you show up in my office hours? They said, well, I thought that was the whole point of office hours, is that that's when I'm not supposed to come. So I guess the bottom line being, we can't always assume that these things that we use a lot in our syllabi and our courses are known. And so there's that concept of making that hidden curriculum more navigable to especially first generation students. And then now let's talk about this idea of stereotype threat, which is kind of where we're coming around to. And again, maybe another quick show of hands and thumbs or whatever you want to show me to if you feel like you're pretty familiar with this concept of stereotype threat and you've seen it before and some of the impact. So I'm seeing, oh, Chris has a dragon. That's, a lot there. So it feels, maybe somewhat mixed. It might be somewhat new to some, and others of you have probably heard of this term before. Whistling Vivaldi was kind of one of the first, at least very popular books that came out that talked about this idea of stereotype threat, which is essentially, the way I would word it, is a fear that people have when they're concerned that a negative stereotype exists and that they're going to confirm that negative stereotype. So it can sometimes bring about very physical reactions. And there are so many studies out there. And again, this is something you can just kind of Google, probably in your own discipline, you can Google stereotype threat and you'll find numerous studies out there that will show many different things. When there is a perceived negative stereotype, and when that especially is reinforced, even in controlled situations, controlled experimental studies, people can do worse than they would be expected to simply because of that stereotype. So for example, for me, if I'm a female and I'm in a class and I kind of have this sense that women don't do very well in engineering, for example, and if I'm about to take a test and somehow it's reinforced that, well, women don't usually do very well in this work, but hey, I'm glad you're here, Bridget, and here you go, good luck. Just sometimes even that very subtle reinforcement can make someone perform less well than they would have. And they've been looking at this in, again, controlled experimental studies for a long time. Most of the consequences are negative in nature. And so here's one example. again, there's many out there, but this one I thought was interesting because it also shows, as we talk about this idea of intersectionality, that we also have students who have, we all, again, have multiple identities and multiple kinds of demographics that we fit into. So this is one about Latino women who were kind of given a double minority status in this controlled experiment and also suffered as a result of stereotype threat in different ways than their Latino male colleagues or their white students. So both being female and being Latina in this instance created almost like a double stereotype threat. However, the good news is, again, these things can be impacted in positive and negative ways. So I thought I'd pull out some good news too, in the sense that this is a study from a biology class where these scholars wanted to look at the identity of how students viewed scientists and wanted to challenge, if you will, and prevent kind of counter stereotypical descriptions of scientists. So they created a homework assignment where they looked at diverse types of scientists and their contributions to the field, and the students had a short homework assignment. It didn't take extra class time, it didn't take extra work. They were able to kind of substitute equal things within the course to add in these homework assignments. But just by adding that in, they were able to look at perceptions of students before and after and see that there were positive shifts in, let me make sure I get this right, in both, they detected shifts in both scientific stereotypes and in the students' ability to see their possible selves in science. So just by adding in different kinds of assignments that showed diverse representations of contributions to the field. So wonderful things that we can do also as a result, or at least small shifts that we can make. And getting into sort of the why. So we certainly can work towards stereotype threat. There's a number of things. This is just one of many websites out there that start looking at what's possible, what can be done. I will provide a caution in that I was just reading a study and I could not for the life of me find it today, but it was somewhat exploring how some of the interventions that we do work differently with different groups. So something that they were looking at that worked really well with Latinx populations did not work well with Black populations in that particular context. So with the takeaway being that we have to be conscious of our environment, of our students, of the context, and what would work well for them. And there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. A lot of this is pretty personal, but there are things that we can do as a result as well. So I think that, that was kind of the big bulk of stuff that I was throwing at you, and I haven't had time to look at the chat myself, but let me do that and also see if there's any burning comments or definitely things you want to share before we kind of get into, I was going to have you do a short reflection and then get into our breakout. So does anyone want to jump in with thoughts or questions, or I'm looking at the chat to make sure I'm not missing anything too. Oh, Maya, great. You use that study. And Karen, you were asked to expound a little bit more.
Which comment, Allegria? Well-intentioned whites? Yeah, so this article I was just using in my assignment this week on cultural humility shows research, and I've done this way too many times myself. It's like, I don't want to I want to do a good job, but I also fear, that I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth. I'm going to say something racially biased, or implicit biases will come out, and I'm just, and so that stuttering, that I want to do a good job, but you're starting to wonder why I'm talking weird with you, in this cross-race interaction. The other is overly expressing positive, oh, I'm so excited to meet you, person of color. That it's not that compared to, so they experimentally manipulated the interaction, right? Cross race or same race interaction. And it wasn't that whites were acting derogatory towards people of color. It was that they were kind of bending over backwards, right? And then just being super self-conscious about what they were saying, and so they would trip themselves up. Whereas people who are more explicitly racist, as opposed to, fearing that they will come across as racist, they don't care. They don't stumble upon themselves as much because they're not trying to monitor and catch themselves in unintended bias. And so interestingly, it's kind of a backfiring effect of, I don't want to be seen as racist, and so I'm going to be extra cautious around you. And people of color are like, what's wrong with her? What's wrong with that white girl? So interestingly, sometimes we can set ourselves up for making it worse, not better. So hard to jump back and forth from chatting to chat feed.
Yes, and I don't know the answer to the question about BIPOC faculty being harsher with populations. I personally don't know of any studies, but there could be out there. But what I would like to offer, because I'm sure there's probably comments you would love to share and might be better served in a small group. So I was going to go back to this screen real quick. And what I would like to ask you to do is reflect for a few minutes before we get into the breakout groups. And I hope you're able to see the screen. I'm not seeing it on the screen in the room yet, but what I wanted to ask you to do is do a little reflection. And depending on sometimes your discipline, you're either like, yes, I want to do this, or, oh my God, she's asking me to do reflection. So feel free to write something out, to jot some bullet points, or even just to kind of visualize in your mind. But as we are embarking on a conversation about stereotype threat, we wanted to also explore some of our own stereotypes. So I wanted to ask you to take a few minutes to describe your ideal student. You can talk about the behaviors, you can talk about how they interact with you, what they do, but essentially either write out or just visualize or think about what is that ideal student, and then to reflect on that description. What might you be holding on to in terms of biases? What sub-stereotypes might be influencing that? And then do you think your students know what your ideal student is, and or how well they match that? And I'll throw out one more before I stop talking. What general stereotype threats might students at CSU Pueblo be facing? So I'm going to stop talking now and give you about 4 minutes to just individually reflect on that before we get into breakouts. right, I'm going to go ahead and end that piece. And we have some time for breakout groups. Again, you're certainly welcome to talk about what you most want to talk about related to these ideas, but I would suggest, as you feel comfortable, share any of the reflections, share any takeaways that you have from your personal reflections. You might think about your main concerns about equity gaps and biases for students on your campus, how you can take into account these potential biases and stereotypes in your teaching, in the work at CSU Pueblo, and also certainly share ideas for next steps, because this is just one of the early conversations with much more to come. So Denise, I think if we maybe go until 4:15 with the breakout groups, that gives us like 25 minutes, and then we could gather back up. But I will let you help figure out how we want to divide our folks up both virtually and in person. And Denise, I think you are getting the breakout groups going. If you are talking to us, you're still on mute, but let me know if you want me to do anything on my part.
Yep, I muted that on purpose. We're getting there.
No worries.
Okay, so we got Amaya and Chris. And that leaves everyone in the room together here. We good? Go ahead. Yes. Okay. I'm fine. Okay.
I think what you have to arrange, you might have to assign them or they have to get off.
No, I
No, you can close the room.
just didn't
Yeah.
get I mean in a room.
Okay, the rest of them.
Folks here are not going to be assigned. Okay. Yep, we're good. Woo. Okay, Bridget, we're in rooms and ready to go. So if you just want to help me.
I think you're muted.
No, I think I took it
Oh,
off.
you got off? Okay, good.
Can you hear me, Bridget?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. It looks like everybody's set. I think I am a host, right? I'll send like a 5-minute warning when we're.
Yeah, I can do that too. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Have a good timekeeper. Here, can do
Trevor, social work.
So, as you feel comfortable, share your takeaways from your personal reflection. What are your main concerns about the gaps, biases, and stereotypes that exist in
Depends a lot on what kind of students that you're talking about, because I sort of made a list for, persons of color versus veterans versus rural students versus non-traditional students. I think each of those has different.
Had a conversation with a student that's trans, and she just got moved into another placement at the school because the person she was with would not tolerate her, and so, you know, there are variations in human. Some people can't take a variation. Particular variation is something that brings up something.
This was another student.
This was another student, it's a teacher, well, going to be a teacher. So they were out in school, but their operating teacher was not.
Oh,
and
and
this
charge to that.
So what do you think about ecclesiastes five, the stereotypes that you built up in this university that you see?
Well, I've seen my students try and navigate the idea that the students of color, that they're underperformers, lazy, and not as prepared as other students. And so when I was just thinking that during the summer, as I was preparing for a class, I had this exercise where they go out on campus and they're using technology. They're doing like a little treasure hunt using GPS. And I always noticed that the women students partly, and then the students of color, they're afraid to ask questions because they don't want the other students to know. I mean, because they don't want to confirm that idea that somehow they're not with it. The other group that sometimes that hits is the non-traditional students. There is that stereotype that they don't understand technology. I mean, sometimes they bring that threat with them, you know, but I have seen those things. And that's the main thing I see is that they won't ask for help when they need it because they don't want to confirm this stereotype.
And I thought that social culture context was really good about bringing up the fact that, you know, if I don't have the skills, if I don't have the social skills or the learning strategies to do what I'm doing within a class, you know, what do you think we could do to help that situation before they actually end up in class? That's part of the concern, because we could try to do it in the class. I mean, our back on track is actually trying to do it within the class, right? It's in the class, and they're trying to bring in things that they didn't have. But what are some ideas that you're thinking about that we could possibly have?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of issue across the university. Talk about this all the time, it's relevant to individual students, but in the system has its own constraints on everything. That can limit them unintentionally too.
I think my concern, so being STEM, we've had several major grants to try to close equity. PAL, C-Base, our next one, which I don't know what it's called, and another one that's coming in. And we've clearly, I mean, the program has clearly improved success rates among URFs. Higher pass rates, higher graduation rates, higher retention rates. But it's improved everybody. Right, so it's not really closing the equity gap. That gap is still there. Like if you take the picture of the boxes, basically put one freaking big box, so everybody's standing on it. But everybody's still the same level they were before, but now they're up. So at some point, our expectations or standards are going to go up, and then that's going to get higher. And we're going to be in the same situation we were before. Now, so thinking of what programs. So right now, those programs, while they're focused on one student, are available to all students. And I think the Department of Education almost requires that. Programs that don't are like TRIO, right? That have a limited, there has to be something about your background that allows you to be in that program. Is that a better situation? Is it better that the program focuses on, only allows that group that you're trying to bring equity for be allowed to be part of it? I don't, you know,
I think there's a multi approach to this kind of idea, because it's just like in special education, you can have inclusion or you can have a separate setting, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, it only works if the people in inclusion actually know what they're doing with the people that are in there. And then they have the support that they need, otherwise the regular classroom would be getting not really the help that they were hoping for, but yet they have these students in there that are not ready. Back on track is kind of an answer to some of that, where they've got the tandem person coming in and saying, I'm gonna do these particular other things, right? For that student to be able to stay in. And then you've got some programs like Trio, which gives more of the social skills area. With their own people that are they're comfortable with and things like that. So some people, some students will be better taken out in a program like Trio, and some people don't want to ever even say that they would have been in that particular group. They want to try to slam into the class and get help that they need, and sometimes they don't ask for help. And you know, I just don't think that there's one path to this working, because the more you individualize something, the more difficult it becomes to understand it. Right.
An interesting point though, because the back on track one for equality, but not necessarily equity, because we don't have to be a URM to participate.
yeah. That's the case with those large programs. Everybody can participate.
I think I can relate to his sentiments about programs that help everybody, and then there are programs that help certain groups. My understanding of most of the problems we solve is that you don't have to be choosing between that and the other ways. It is how we go about taking advantage of that and taking advantage of the others to help people. Therefore, whatever we are doing in STEM, the programs that we get money from the text, I think we are doing the right thing because that's what we promised and that's what they want. But in whatever is happening in programs like Trio, that's what is supposed to happen. And therefore, what we should be doing is let's take advantage of the STEM programs the way we are, and then let's take advantage of the Trio programs the way they are. And overall, we will have helped a lot of people and everyone. That's one. The second part about it, they said something about an ideal student. I think we all have an ideal student in our head. What is important isn't what the students do to us, is our understanding and our attitude when a student does not look like the ideal student. How do we go about taking care of the situation? For example, I have one item here that says my ideal student would be doing 1, 2, 3, 4. And one of them says this student will be asking questions when they need clarification. The question is, if they don't ask a question, what should I assume? And the assumption may be the one that you have to worry about. My assumption that someone is not asking questions because they understand everything or because everything is clear to them is probably wrong. But there is someone out there who is not asking questions. And the reason they're not asking is not because they don't have questions. It's because they are really scared to death. And if they ask a question, it's going to confirm. So what am I doing in the classroom to make sure that that thinking is kind of coming down? So what I do to people who ask questions is there are things that I say in response. When I say those things, I believe the next person who doubts about whether they should ask a question, they are probably going to be motivated to ask that question. Because I actually say loudly for someone who asks a question, say, thank you for asking that question. And I think this is going to benefit just not you, but for all others. And so because I reinforce the idea that people should be asking questions, I believe that I'm encouraging others to ask questions. And then I have tests where students wait till the end of the class. And then they come privately to me and they ask questions. And when they do that, I still encourage them to ask me those questions. So I'm compensating for what they didn't do during the class. But at the same time, I'm also encouraging them that next time they should ask in class because it may benefit other people as well.
I have a couple of thoughts. As I listen to these presentations, I think if you were to ask me from sort of an ideological point of view, social justice and equity is a part of the work that I do, social work. So I think that they are preaching to the choir somewhat with this. But the maybe more skeptical side of me starts to say, well, how do we untangle some of these things? Because when we're talking about equity gaps in the programs designed to reduce some of the equity gaps, the skeptical side of me says, how much of this is about doing the right thing versus retaining students as paying customers? Because I think it's really difficult to untangle those things. I think if you were to ask us what we thought of it, we would say, well, of course we want to do the right thing, but I think that there are so many competing priorities around enrollment and retention that it can, we don't necessarily know what we're talking about when it comes to equity. Like, what after we unpack all of those things, what does equity look like? The other thing that I have, I struggle with a little bit untangling with this stereotype thread is how it manifests in students. I teach in our MSW program, which we're still building in a lot of ways. So we're frankly probably admitting a lot of students who are applying. And a lot of them are working and doing other sorts of things. And so I think that stereotype threat sometimes manifests itself with them as either delaying doing the assignments, being very busy, and maybe they really are too, wanting extra time on assignments and all of that. And I have to, and I don't know that I'm ever really able to do this, but untangle how much of that is because of their unique lived experience and how much of that is that they are just too busy to do all of this. They're too busy to be doing placements along with full-time work and along with full-time study. And nobody's having honest conversations with them about that because of the other competing priorities. When I think about ideal student, I think, well, my ideal student changes from time to time. Like I think that my ideal student is someone who's interested and engaged in doing the work. But even unpacking what that means can be a little bit messy. So I think in short, where I leave sort of this conversation is that if you're to ask me, do you believe in equity and that we should be doing all that we can do? Yes, of course. But I think we should also be asking some of the difficult questions about what is motivating the rhetoric around equity. And are we doing it because we truly want to build up, or are we doing it because we're a cog in the machine?
Or you take advantage
Or
of
they're
being a cog in the machine.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And I don't think that these things are mutually exclusive necessarily. I think we could be a cog in the machine and still believe that education changes the life of the people that are in front of us and still do good for the people in front of us. But for me, the conversations are sometimes missing some of these other motivations, and it becomes a little bit unpopular to view it critically. Like, to say, hey, well, what does this inclusive pedagogy mean? What is it? What is really the driving force behind it, other than us believing that it's a good thing?
And it's only become this way through democracy and through years of working on getting people to be more civilized that America, the United States, in particular, right now, is in this dance of trying to bring people into the fold of it. Well, there's still people in the university level who think this is a part of the say that they are and not, right? And they are business and the things
everybody belong everywhere. Yeah.
Everybody belongs everywhere.
Yeah.
And can everybody do that? I mean, if I'm on the table with, if I'm on the table with a surgeon, I want that surgeon, I don't care who they are, they want skills.
Sure.
Skills before they touch my body. But we're in the business of trying to get more equalized, so more people of different color, different genders, different whatever, are at this level. At this level, we don't want to lose the level, and I think a lot of people are thinking, oh, we have to down the curriculum. We don't have to give curriculum that is strong as we would have been before, because these people can't do it, and that's not what they're actually saying. They're saying these three areas have not been equalized in the school system. You know, have not been our community and things like that. So we're trying to get more into these three areas so that we have more people that truly can do their academic performance, and it's not going to be too hard. I think that's what we're doing today. We're trying to do it today. I do a practice in my classroom for learners where they have to keep looking at people with different variations. Look at them the same way. Talk about what some people think beauty is, right? Not beauty and things like that. And so, you know, we do discriminate, all of us, when we're trying to find a mate. Or we're trying to, you know, we have these things that are in our mind, right? So this idea of breaking the idea that when I'm looking at someone, I can look at them and touch them. People here, I'm very yeah, we still have the title. We made up, you know, and a certain group of people made up this thing called education, and they took control of it. So this fight right now that we have in our system, because we do have enough of these people coming into our system actually that are at this level. They're working, they're pushing, and so now that's what's happening. And I think that's a good thing, that it's not me. And there are professors that resent having people in their classroom not do the work and don't want to necessarily do the learning stuff. I think that's where I'm struggling, because I'm pretty new to this game. And I've been a teacher for a lot of years, and you know, a lot of different classrooms with, you know, kids who obviously had quite different backgrounds from me. And I'm seeing that in my students, but with that, I'm stuck on the ideal student, because I got three of the things you said, and I try really hard to, you know, be equitable, but it is really hard when you're like, I'm not going to want to, you know, make this content applicable and interesting and engaging, and my biases come out when they don't show up for class, or they're kind of like their eyes are glazed over, or they don't turn in, you know, assignments. And I try. They're from a different space. Things are going on. This one tells me this is happening. This one tells me this is happening. And I get that. And I try to be flexible so that I am allowing, you know, there to be equity. But it's really hard. It's really like, I'm not sure where I go. So glad I'm here, because it's great to listen to everybody's stories. There's a book called White Fragility that I used in the last class that I read myself and thought, I had no idea that we have this idea that you're supposed to let them do everything that they want to do because they have the suffering going on. And the answer is no. You know, there's got to be a way that, you know, we don't want to take our that over the top compassion where you're going like, you know, oh, okay, you had all these things happen to you, so take another week to turn your work in. Right, and you want this to mean something. If they get a degree, you want it to mean something. Right, you want it to be rigorous enough that they feel like, okay.
Well, I've always felt like one of the biggest types of racism in academia is the racism of low expectation. And, you know, we see it a lot of times in athletes that are coming in and have been given a pass because they needed them to be the star player on the team. And how unfair is that to them? in with partly being able to read or what have you. So, I mean, so that is a form of racism to not expect someone to, because you're basically thinking that they don't have the capacity to level up. So,
That I think goes into the social skills development even of professors. And I've other people say, you know, no, the answer is not just to let somebody write. You know, that doesn't help them either. You know, doesn't help when you have a physical handicap to do something for them all the time, right? You end up making them into vegetable by the time you get out of school instead of somebody that can actually do something. It's going to be harder for them.
Denise, are you able to hear me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, we are already at 4:15. I realize I don't have access to close the breakouts or give them a minute or two warning. So if
Other
you-
thing between quality.
I can do that.
Quality,
thank you.
because as an instructor, everybody's the same thing. Equity's hard. Because it's an individual thing. Your time. And I've got 100 people and I'm in a course. But even now, you know, when I'm on rock, and it's
Thank you.
I sleep 4 hours a night. Something's got to stop. Right? And the university is going more and more, giving more and more work. This is an example, right? Being a faculty fellow. So it's still more, it's what I want to do, right? But when I want to do this, that means something else is going to happen, which is typically tends to be personal life. And that's not fair to faculty. The faculty work
totally lived that in the last 2 days. Like,
way more than they should.
Yeah.
And their other parts of their life suffers. And as we push farther and farther in this, it's more and more time. Because that's the only way it works. Right? If you don't treat everybody individually, it's easy. But if you treat everybody individually, it's a long time.
And I think the way, I think it's true because it's crazy right now. It's crazy.
I hear you.
Because I have online classes too, and it's like a crazy reading. There's ways to help build skills into an online class to make it easier for everybody to understand. You know, there's things we can learn differently like that, but we can't individualize like you're talking about when you have 30, 40 people in an online class.
It's not.
You have to design.
If you're teaching 12 credits, each course has 20 kids in it, that's insane. Or if you want equity, and that's 20 kids, or if you've got 50, my goodness. Impossible.
like teaching special education, which I have, but I can't imagine doing that for all of them. Why can't that individualize that?
Yeah, I can help. I mean, you can help by doing, like, I said, HBA, good examples. I make templates now. I do rubrics. I make things, you know, I chunk it. I make more modules. I make things where people check each other. I've been able to do some of that work that I understand because of special education to do the online classes that I would like to be able to share too. That's one way to help. But it's still not the answer. You're right. They're going to still be until the universities understand that, you know, right now in education, 4 classes is full time. 3, 4, 5 versus 6. And if you have 30, 40, you know,
Okay, everybody's coming back down.
They're coming back in.
All right.
Welcome back, everyone.
I know.
It's how we're doing it.
It's crazy.
All right. Well, we have a few minutes left. I think it would be really nice if we could share some of the overall takeaways or at least kind of big enduring questions that you all are grappling with in your group. So I don't know exactly who are in each of the breakouts online, but maybe if we could tap into the fellows that were in those groups to at least start us off and share some overall takeaways. So, you know, Chris or Karen, would either of you want to jump in?
When you want me to start with?
But you just.
What I said,
Yeah.
so.
So Rick is gonna.
So my difficulty is honestly that equality is easy, right? Because you provide the same thing for everybody as an instructor, it's easy. Equity is hard and it's time consuming. And it's individual attention to your students. I mean, that's what education should be. But realistically, like I was just telling them, I work 80 to 100 hours a week. And I have no family time, and we do more and more each year. And for this to actually work, somebody at some level above us, it's got to change, because we're not going to manufacture that care. Right? I'm very close to being done with teaching because of the amount of work. So I totally understand equity, and I totally believe in it, but for it to realistically work, it's time. And there just isn't anymore for me, at least on my side of things.
So in our group, Chris Pisici, I hope I say it right, or Pisici, brought up the same issue about it just takes time. And I'm surprised to hear how many of us are so burnt out, Rick, because I am also really, really overwhelmed. Like I like to have hobbies, and this semester is just, and sleep. So I think that might be a discussion that we need to have of how burnt out people who care are. At any rate, but my response to that, and maybe you guys can weigh what you think, that maybe instead of individualized assignments, that maybe it's just being aware of our mindset. If you're just aware of your bias towards certain things, and we talked about some like motivation, and if students were not motivated, others of us had bias against student athletes. They come and especially male student athletes, I know, and just being aware, maybe reflecting on that like we're doing today. I'm not taking any other time, but that might make us more compassionate when we run into those students. We might understand them better, and we might be able to address their needs when they ask for help or when they need help, just because we're aware that before this reflection we would have brushed them off, or we would have not taken them as seriously. But now that we're examining our biases, we might be able to be more receptive, and they might feel more comfortable with us, and it might just be a little baby step on creating a more positive relationship. So it's not quite creating individual assignments, but it might just be I don't know, just a little bit. So that's how I responded to the we need to do more work, because clearly we're all feeling a little like that's not possible.
And Karen, so thank you, Amaya. Karen, that is exactly what we kind of followed up on, is perhaps we should do less and do it better and have students retain less information, but at least they go away feeling like they learned some things. Because Amaya said that she is starting to cover a little less. I too, instead of 5 chapters a semester, I'm doing 4 chapters. But I agree with what we just heard, that we have to then individualize academic career paths, and what that equals is time. And I do that. I differentiate my learning in all my classes. I am helping students that need more help. I'm offering office hours, but also tutoring. But I do have some, what you mentioned, Bridget, today is, I have a student who's an engineering student, and she can't conjugate a verb in Italian. And I'm thinking, I don't want to walk across a bridge that you're building. And that's sad that I thought that, I thought that. And as a professor, I shouldn't. But it's something that happened, and it resonated me when you said that sometimes we bring these kind of fixed mindsets that we have about students. So, I agree with everything that's been said. I'm trying to be more compassionate. I'm trying to individualize the learning, but in the end, it really requires a lot more on our part. And with a 4-4 load, it's just like a 5-5 or 6-6 load. So it requires tons of time.
Very good point.
So I I struggle with covering less material because in the end, my students have to compete against for jobs, right? And they're not going to compete well if they don't have the material to compete.
For instance, I have a student in my one-on-one class who's interested in doing a math minor. And those are pretty fair standards. But if I were to cover lab and just extend the time to get the first class required in the minor, which is already 3 additional classes from where they start. So I cannot cover last because that means that they might not even get to a minor program to even get that degree to be competitive. Because that means like those classes are fairly standardized across institutions for what mathematical needs. And well, I'm talking about classes that they can't even get to them.
Yeah.
If I were to reduce the content much. So.
I think definitely, at least in chemistry, I don't speak about anything else. You know, what we do at 100, you need for 200. There's the prereqs go all the way up. So it's not, I mean, I'm not criticizing anybody who doesn't do that, but that's just how our structure is, right? So if we cover less here, we cover less here, we cover less here, we cover less here. And basically you're graduating like a sophomore from anywhere else, right? And that they can't, that's not competitive then.
Yeah, because I've had this conversation with a colleague, and essentially they're like, just like support the students, well, we need to add like an additional math course, but that's not feasible because they need to graduate at some point. So it's hard.
If you go back to that study that you showed, the mindset matters with the professors, even in the STEM, as far as whether those students can be pulled up to what you need them to have, has to come from both sides, the student and the professor, and that they just needed to go and do more. They have to do more. They shouldn't do less. They actually should have to learn how to do more.
Yeah.
Because they're missing particular things. So they need to add in more social skills. We need to add in more time, more tutoring, like we're doing with the Back on Track. More. They not less.
Yeah.
They actually are going to have to work harder in order to stay at a level to be able to graduate from a particular degree or get into a different degree. That's the other point though too, right?
So then, but that goes back to what Trevor was saying, that, you know, are we really benefiting a student if they're coming in, paying tuition, leaving with that, you know, and as a science, as a chemistry, if you get a job in chemistry, you're pretty good, right? You'll be able to pay back your student loans in 5 years or whatever, depending on how it is. If you're not, you know, if we're putting them in a major that's not going to improve their or their kids' lives, then that doesn't seem right.
Any university degree, if they win it.
Welcome to the humanities.
Sorry.
They're going to take out a ton of debt and not be able to pay it back, and they're going to be an adjunct instructor and be living at the food pantry.
And I understand. So
Hard to have empathy there for you, Rick, but no, these are valid points.
You know, and I understand that any college university degree improves an individual, but it may not improve their lot, their life, right? And especially, so I sit on the financial aid appeals committee, and I see the kids, the 70% that don't graduate, who come in for 2 years, pay, and are $20,000 in debt, and we just wrecked them for the rest of their lives. You know, so it's fine if you graduate, you're probably in a better situation, but if you don't, you're in a worse. You know, and even if you graduate, if you graduate with $50,000 in debt and you're making $20,000 a year, you're in trouble, and we hurt you. You know, we made you a better, broader person, but sorry, killed the conversation.
That's also advising.
It's advising. It's a huge advising. Yeah.
And the one thing I do in my classes is I speak louder.
Pull your mask away from your mouth. Pull your mask away from your mouth. I think we can hear you better.
That's not a good idea because I think that's just positive.
Oh, wait, no. he
Yeah,
won't.
I'm not taking my mask off. Yeah, yeah. But one thing that I do is that every week they submit all of their activities instead of as homework for peer review. And I can I look at their work, but I mostly focus on what they commented on the things that I would comment to begin with. So I offloaded that part of the grading and all that part to the students themselves. And they seem more than eager to pick that up, a lot. And they are, even are getting on each other. Can you circle your answer? Things like that.
Yeah.
And so doing things like that have helped offload some of my workload of what I want to look at to each other, building up some of those other skills. But it's also hard to get them to be trained to do that. And certain demographics of students are more likely to do that type of work. I think widening potential gaps, you know? Like white male students aren't reviewing as much as white women students, you know? Like, so I think it's a good idea, but there's different things happening, I think.
And Karen, were you in the other group, and were there any other takeaways you wanted to share before we wrap up?
I was in our conversation. I think we tried to reframe what we thought about our expectations. Like, what does it mean to be prepared? What are we asking when we say we'd like you to practice good time management, right? To have things, meeting due dates and things like that. And maybe that if we know more of the roles and responsibilities our students play, then they may be managing their time as best as they can. And so it's not necessary. And so sometimes, perhaps we need to be flexible with due dates. So I know Rick and I had that conversation of, well, if the material stacks and builds on it, then giving them more time doesn't help move the learning along. So I think that's discipline specific in some circumstances. But in terms of, when a student seems to perhaps appear not motivated, it might not be that they're not motivated. When you say, I want you to reflect on this, and they say, well, how much do you want me to say? Like, give me a word count, and that might be more of, we need a role model more for them. What do we mean by that? Because they're trying to obey, or they're trying to be efficient and not necessarily minimalist, but they may not really know what it means to elaborate on something. So I gave the example with the hypothesis feature. I say, make 6 substantive comments, and here's some examples. I'll give my comments in there to role model. Well, this is what I mean by substantive, and so, and then give them also permission to say, I don't know what this means, but here's my best guess. And then I can get greater insight into that, or define words you don't know. And then I'm dumbfounded with some of the most basic words. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm totally talking over their heads. And I don't even think I'm doing that at all by them displaying here's what I think is a basic vocabulary word, not technical jargon, and they're defining that. So I'm like, okay, so that helps us kind of, be more ready to meet them where they're at, I guess, with respect to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know we are just a little bit past our time, so I just wanted to offer as well. Like, I would love to say this work doesn't take any more time, but of course I'm never going to say that. There certainly are things that we can do that, sometimes we, like Karen was just saying, can do a lot more on the front end of an assignment or an activity that ends up saving us time later on because we're not answering a bunch of questions for students later. Or, a lot of the metacognitive stuff that's out there are things like adding a question to your exam that's about how they studied for it, or adding like a 5-minute component to a study skill, preparing for a test where the students just talk to think, pair, share for a few minutes about how best to prepare for it. So there are lots of ways to do it in small chunks, but it's certainly something we have to think about. So it is more time, but there are certainly different levels of what we can and can't do. But I'm with you. I feel the burnout too. And I guess I would go back to what Amaya was saying earlier, that, if you remember that chart from the University of Chicago, that like mindsets underlie all of this. So, if there's any one thing that we could do, perhaps just over the next couple of weeks, it could be just really giving students that message that we think they can be successful and we want them to work and we want to hold them to high standards. Nobody is talking about lowering standards, but when we're giving them constructive feedback or sometimes harsh feedback, it's because we believe in them and we want them to do well. So, changing that, and I'm sure a lot of you already do this, but maybe just really being intentional about that with students, that could be one first step, at least for us all to work a little bit more on. But I will stop there, and then I don't know, Denise or Lynn, if you wanted to say anything as by way of wrap up, but this has been some really great conversation so far.
I just want to say thank you, Bridget, very much for this conversation, and I appreciate all the great conversation everybody's been having, and I hope everybody has a good weekend. Hope to see you again in another Faculty Academy. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bridget.